What if I told you that in May 1945, American soldiers and Nazi Wehrmacht troops stood shoulder to shoulder, defending a castle against an SS attack? Sounds impossible, right? But it happened. And it's one of the craziest stories from World War II that almost nobody talks about. This is the Battle of Castle Itter, the only time in history where Americans and Germans officially fought on the same side. And the Germans never saw it coming, so it's May 1945. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. The war in Europe is basically over. Everyone knows Germany lost. But in the Austrian Alps, there's this medieval castle called Schloss Itter. And inside this castle, there's a group of high-value French prisoners. We're talking former prime ministers, generals, famous tennis players, and political figures that the Nazis kept locked up during the war. These weren't regular prisoners of war. These were VIPs. The SS had been holding them hostage for years, thinking they could use them as bargaining chips. But now that Germany was collapsing, everything was falling apart. The SS guards at the castle knew the end was coming. Most of them just abandoned their posts and ran away. But not all of them. There was still a hardcore group of Waffen-SS soldiers in the area who were absolutely fanatic. They refused to surrender. They were hunting down deserters, executing anyone who tried to quit, and they were looking for targets. When they heard that Castle Itter was being abandoned and that there were French prisoners inside, they decided to attack. Not to free anybody, not for any military reason, just pure revenge and hatred. The French prisoners inside the castle knew they were in serious danger. The war might be over, but they were about to be massacred by SS fanatics who had nothing to lose. They needed help fast, and that's where this story gets absolutely wild. There was this German Wehrmacht officer named Major Josef Gangl. Now understand something important here. The Wehrmacht was the regular German army. The SS was the Nazi paramilitary force. They were different. A lot of Wehrmacht soldiers hated the SS. They thought the SS were criminals and psychopaths who gave all German soldiers a bad name. Major Gangl was one of those guys. By May 1945, he knew Germany had lost. He knew the Nazi cause was finished, and he didn't want any more pointless death. When he heard that French prisoners at Castle Itter were about to be slaughtered by the SS, he made a decision that would have gotten him executed just weeks earlier. He decided to help them. But here's the problem. Gangl and his small group of Wehrmacht soldiers weren't enough to defend the castle against a full SS attack. They needed more firepower, they needed backup. So Gangl did something absolutely insane. He went looking for American troops. Now put yourself in the Americans' shoes for a second. The war is over, you're celebrating, Germany surrendered, and suddenly this German officer shows up with a white flag saying he wants to fight alongside you against other Germans. Would you trust him? Would you think it's a trap? Captain John C. Lee was the American officer Gangl found. Lee was leading a small relief column in Austria, just mopping up after the German surrender. When Gangl approached him and explained the situation, Lee had every reason to shoot him or take him prisoner. Instead, he listened. Gangl explained that there were French VIP prisoners about to be killed by SS fanatics. He offered to fight with the Americans to save them. Lee looked at this German officer, thought about it for maybe 10 seconds, and said yes. Just like that. Two enemies became allies. Lee took a small force of American soldiers, joined up with Gangl's Wehrmacht troops, and they rushed to Castle Itter together. American and German soldiers riding in the same vehicles, carrying the same mission. Nobody in human history had ever seen anything like it. They reached the castle on May the 5th, 1945. That's literally 2 days before Germany officially surrendered. The war was ending, but this battle was just beginning. Inside the castle were 17 French prisoners, including 2 former prime ministers, Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud. There was also a famous tennis star named Jean Borotra, and a bunch of generals and political figures. These people had survived years of Nazi imprisonment. They had survived the worst of World War II, and now, hours away from liberation, they were about to be killed for no reason except hatred. But now they had defenders, American soldiers, German soldiers, and the French prisoners themselves, all prepared to fight together. The combined American-German force set up defensive positions around the castle. They had maybe 14 Americans, 10 to 12 Wehrmacht soldiers, and about 10 of the French prisoners who knew how to fight. Against them was a Waffen-SS company. That's somewhere between 100 and 150 hardcore SS fanatics who literally had nothing to lose. The numbers were not good. The defenders were massively outnumbered. They didn't have heavy weapons. They were defending a medieval castle that wasn't designed for modern warfare. The stone walls were thick, sure, but they had huge windows and multiple entry points. It wasn't a fortress, it was a prison that was about to become a battlefield. Early in the morning of May 5th, the SS attack began. They came in hard and fast, trying to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. The Americans and Germans fought side by side, sharing ammunition, covering each other's positions, communicating in broken English and German and hand signals. Think about how weird this moment was. Just days earlier, these men were trying to kill each other. Now they were brothers in arms fighting for the same cause. An American rifleman would run out of ammunition, and a German soldier would toss him a magazine. A Wehrmacht gunner would get pinned down, and an American would provide covering fire. It was cooperation, born out of absolute necessity and a shared enemy. The French prisoners weren't just sitting around waiting to be rescued either. Jean Borotra, the tennis player, did something absolutely legendary. During a brief break in the fighting, he volunteered to escape the castle and run for reinforcements. This guy was in his 40s, hadn't played professional tennis in years, was weakened from imprisonment, and he literally volunteered to parkour his way out of a castle under siege. And he did it. Borotra climbed over the castle wall, sprinted through fields while SS soldiers shot at him, and made it to the nearest American position. He told them what was happening and begged for reinforcements. Thanks to him, a larger American relief force started heading toward the castle, but they weren't going to arrive in time. Back at Castle Itter, the situation was getting desperate. The SS kept coming in waves. They had more men, more ammunition, and more determination. The defenders were running low on everything. Every time they pushed back one SS assault, another one came. The fighting went on for hours. At one point, the SS brought up an anti-tank gun and started blasting the castle. The thick walls held, but the windows shattered and stone fragments flew everywhere. Several defenders were wounded by shrapnel. The noise was deafening. The smell of gunpowder filled every room. This medieval castle that had stood for centuries was being torn apart by modern warfare. And here's where the story gets even more intense. Major Josef Gangl, the German officer who started this whole alliance, who risked everything to save the French prisoners, who fought alongside Americans against his own countrymen, he was killed during the battle. A sniper shot him while he was protecting Édouard Daladier, one of the former French prime ministers. Gangl died fighting for people who had been enemies of Germany just days before. He died as a hero, protecting innocent lives from fanatics. The Americans and the French prisoners who were there never forgot him. They called him one of the bravest men they ever met. The SS attack intensified even more after that. They knew they were close to breaking through. The defenders were almost out of ammunition. Some of them were down to their last few bullets. The French prisoners were preparing to fight hand to hand if the SS broke through the gates. This was going to be a last stand. And then, just when it seemed like everything was lost, they heard it. The sound of American tanks. The relief force that Jean Borotra had summoned was arriving. A full American armoured column came rolling up to Castle Itter, and when the SS saw those tanks, they broke and ran. The battle was over. The Americans had arrived just in time. The French prisoners were saved. The combined American-German defence had held just long enough. Against all odds, this impossible alliance had won. The aftermath of the battle was bizarre. Here you had American soldiers who had just fought alongside Wehrmacht troops. Technically, those German soldiers were still enemy combatants. The war hadn't officially ended yet, but Captain Lee refused to take Gangel's men as prisoners. He told them they had fought with honour and could go home. Most of them just disappeared into the Austrian countryside, trying to get back to their families. The French prisoners were evacuated to safety. All 17 of them survived. These were people who had spent years in Nazi custody, who had seen the worst of humanity, and in their final hours of captivity they saw something different. They saw enemies become allies. They saw Germans risk their lives to save French prisoners from other Germans. It completely changed how some of them thought about the war. Edouard Daladier, who had been Prime Minister of France when the war started, who had declared war on Germany, was saved by a German officer. Paul Reynaud, another former French Prime Minister, fought alongside Wehrmacht soldiers. The tennis champion Jean Borotra became a war hero for his crazy escape run. These people had stories that nobody would believe if they hadn't all been there to witness it. In the years after the war, the survivors of Castle Itter stayed in touch. The French prisoners, the American soldiers, even some of the German Wehrmacht troops who fought there. They held reunions. They shared stories. They honoured Major Josef Gangel's memory. In Austria, they put up a memorial to Gangel, calling him a hero who died fighting against Nazi fanaticism. The Battle of Castle Itter became known as the strangest battle of World War II. It was the only time Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers officially fought together. It happened just days before the war ended, and almost nobody today knows about it. So why did this happen? How did sworn enemies end up fighting side by side? It comes down to a few things. First, by May 1945, a lot of Wehrmacht soldiers were done with the war. They knew Germany lost. They were tired of fighting for a lost cause. Many of them hated the SS and what the Nazis had done to Germany's reputation. Major Josef Gangel represented a type of German soldier that gets forgotten in history. He wasn't a Nazi. He was a professional military officer who served his country, but when he saw innocent people about to be murdered for no reason, he chose to do the right thing. Even if it meant fighting against his own countrymen, even if it meant allying with the enemy, he put humanity above everything else. Captain John C. Lee represented something just as important. He could have easily dismissed Gangel as a liar or a spy. He could have taken him prisoner and left the French to their fate. But Lee was willing to trust a former enemy when lives were on the line. He made a split-second decision to believe in Gangel's sincerity. And that decision saved 17 lives. The French prisoners showed incredible courage too. These weren't soldiers. Most of them were politicians, intellectuals, athletes. But when the fighting started, they picked up weapons and defended themselves. They didn't just wait to be rescued. They fought alongside their rescuers. And that's what makes this story so powerful. You had 3 groups of people who had every reason to hate each other. French prisoners who had suffered under Nazi occupation. American soldiers who had lost friends fighting Germans. Wehrmacht troops who had spent years at war with France and America. But in that moment, at that castle, none of that mattered. What mattered was protecting innocent lives from fanatics. The SS soldiers attacking the castle represented the worst of humanity. They were fighting for a dead cause. They were trying to kill prisoners who had already been freed. They had nothing to gain. They were just spreading death for the sake of death, and they lost. They lost because good people from 3 different nations put aside their differences and stood together. There's a lot of lessons in this story. One is that wars create enemies, but shared values can create allies. Another is that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking every rule you were taught. Gangle broke the ultimate rule for a soldier. He turned against his own army, but he did it to save innocent people. History remembers him as a hero because of it. This battle also shows that even in the darkest moments of human history, people can still make the choice to be good. World War II was one of the most evil events in human history. The Holocaust, the bombings, the mass killings, all of it was terrible beyond words. But at Castle Itter, in the last days of that evil war, there was a moment of light, a moment where enemies realized they had more in common with each other than with the fanatics who wanted to keep killing. It's also a reminder that history is complicated. We like to think of wars in simple terms, good guys versus bad guys, allies versus Axis. But reality is messier. There were good people on every side. There were evil people on every side. The Wehrmacht had soldiers like Gangle who fought for honor and humanity. It also had soldiers who committed war crimes. The SS was largely composed of fanatics and criminals, but even some of them eventually realized how wrong they were. What makes the Battle of Castle Itter so important isn't just that it happened. It's what it represents. It represents the possibility of redemption. It represents the idea that it's never too late to do the right thing. Major Gangle could have just gone home. He could have ignored the French prisoners and focused on surviving. Instead, he risked everything to save them. And he paid with his life. Captain Lee could have followed regulations and rejected Gangle's offer. He could have waited for orders or backup. Instead, he trusted his instincts and took a chance on a former enemy. That trust saved lives. The French prisoners could have given up hope. They could have assumed they were doomed. Instead, they fought for their own survival. Jean Barotre's escape run was one of the gutsiest things anyone did in the entire war. Every person at that battle made choices that day, choices to trust, to fight, to risk, to believe in something bigger than themselves, and those choices made the difference between life and death. After the war, the Battle of Castle Itter was largely forgotten. It didn't fit the narrative people wanted to tell about World War II. People wanted clear heroes and villains, Americans good, Germans bad. The idea that American and German soldiers fought together confused that narrative, so the story got buried in obscure military histories. For decades, only military historians and the survivors themselves knew about it. But in recent years, the story has started to get more attention. Books have been written about it, documentaries have covered it. People are finally learning about this incredible moment in history. One of the reasons the story resonates today is because it shows that cooperation is possible even in the worst circumstances. In our current world, where division seems to be everywhere, where people are more polarized than ever, the Battle of Castle Itter reminds us that unity is possible, that former enemies can work together when they share a common goal. It also reminds us that individuals matter. Major Gangle was just one person, Captain Lee was just one person. But their choices had enormous impact. They didn't wait for someone else to save those French prisoners. They didn't pass the responsibility to someone higher up. They saw a problem and they fixed it. That's real heroism. The castle itself still stands today. Schloss Itter is in Austria, and you can visit it. There's a memorial to Major Joseph Gangle in the nearby town. The castle has been turned into a hotel, ironically. The same place where one of the strangest battles in history happened is now a peaceful tourist destination. Some of the French prisoners who survived went on to have incredible post-war careers. Jean Barotre continued to be involved in sports and became a respected figure in France. The politicians returned to public life. All of them told the story of Castle Itter whenever they could. They wanted people to know about the Germans and Americans who saved them. The American soldiers who fought there went home after the war. Most of them lived quiet lives. Captain Lee never sought fame for what he did. He considered it just part of his duty. But the French prisoners never forgot him. They stayed in contact with him for years, thanking him for his courage. The German Wehrmacht soldiers who survived mostly disappeared into history. After the war, being associated with the Wehrmacht was complicated. Many just wanted to move on and forget. But those who fought at Castle Itter had something different to remember. They could tell their children and grandchildren that they fought for something good at the end, that their last battle wasn't for the Nazis, it was to save innocent people. The SS soldiers who attacked the castle were mostly killed or captured shortly after. The war ended 2 days later. Whatever happened to the survivors isn't well documented. They don't get remembered as anything other than the villains of this story, which is exactly what they were. So what should we take away from the Battle of Castle Itter? First, that history is full of surprises, that even in the most documented war in human history, there are stories that sound too crazy to be true. Second, that people are capable of incredible things when they choose to be. Third, that enemies can become allies when they face a greater threat together. This battle lasted less than a day. It involved maybe 200 people total. In the grand scheme of World War II, which killed over 70 million people, it was a tiny footnote. But it mattered to those 17 French prisoners. It mattered to Major Gangle, who gave his life for it. It mattered to Captain Lee and his men, and it should matter to us because it shows what's possible when people choose humanity over hatred. War is terrible. World War II was one of the darkest chapters in human history, but even in that darkness there were moments of light, moments where people made the right choice, moments where former enemies realized they were all human beings who valued the same things: life, freedom, justice, honor. The Battle of Castle Itter was one of those moments. It was the day Americans and Germans fought side by side. It was the day a Wehrmacht officer became a hero by protecting his former enemies. It was the day a tennis player became a war hero by sprinting through gunfire. It was the day impossible became reality. And it's a day we should never forget, not because it changes the overall story of World War II, but because it reminds us that even in humanity's worst moments, individual people can still choose to do extraordinary things. That redemption is always possible. That trust between enemies can exist. That doing the right thing matters more than following orders or sticking to sides. Major Joseph Gangle is buried in Austria with full military honors. His tombstone doesn't call him a Wehrmacht officer. It calls him a hero who died defending freedom and protecting innocent lives. The people he saved made sure of that. They wanted the world to know that this German officer was one of the good ones. Captain John C. Lee returned to America and lived a long, quiet life. He rarely talked about Castle Itter. When people asked about his service, he would mention it briefly and move on. He didn't think what he did was that special. He just saw people who needed help and helped them. To him, that's what any decent person would do. The 17 French prisoners all went home. They reunited with their families. They tried to return to normal life after years of imprisonment. But Castle Itter stayed with them forever. They had witnessed something unique. They had been saved by an alliance that shouldn't have existed. And they spent the rest of their lives making sure people knew about it. This is the story the history books often skip. It doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of World War II. It's complicated. It requires nuance. It forces us to see Wehrmacht soldiers as individuals, some good, some bad, rather than a faceless enemy. It shows Americans cooperating with Germans just days before the official end of the war. It's messy and complicated and real, but that's exactly why it matters. Real history is messy. Real people are complicated. Real situations don't always have clear answers. The Battle of Castle Itter is a perfect example of that. It was the right thing to do, but it broke every rule. It was a military victory, but hardly anyone knows about it. It saved 17 people, which seems small, but those 17 people mattered. Every life matters. That's the ultimate lesson of this story. Major Gangle believed it enough to die for it. Captain Lee believed it enough to trust a former enemy. The French prisoners believed it enough to fight for their own survival. And the American and German soldiers who fought together believed it enough to put aside years of war and hatred for a few hours. The Battle of Castle Itter was the last battle of World War II in Europe. It happened on May 5, 1945. Germany officially surrendered on May 7th, just 2 days later. In those 2 days, the impossible happened. Enemies became allies. A German officer died a hero. Americans and Wehrmacht fought together, and 17 innocent people were saved from senseless murder. It's a story that deserves to be told. It's a story that needs to be remembered, not because it changes our understanding of World War II, but because it shows us what humanity is capable of when we choose to see each other as people first and enemies second, when we choose to value life over ideology, when we choose to do what's right instead of what's easy. The Germans never expected US and Wehrmacht soldiers to fight side by side. Neither did the Americans, neither did the French. Hell, nobody expected it because it seemed impossible, but it happened, and it worked, and it saved lives. That's the power of choosing humanity. That's the power of redemption. That's the power of individuals making the right choice, even when everything tells them not to. Major Gangle, Captain Lee, John Borotra, and everyone else at Castle Itter that day were just ordinary people in an extraordinary situation. They didn't set out to make history. They just tried to survive and protect innocent lives. But in doing so, they created one of the most inspiring stories of World War II, a story about enemies becoming allies, a story about trust and sacrifice, a story about the best of humanity shining through in the worst of times. A story that reminds us that it's never too late to do the right thing, that redemption is always possible, that former enemies can work together when they share a common goal. The Battle of Castle Itter, May 5, 1945. The day Americans and Germans fought as brothers in arms, the day a Wehrmacht officer died protecting French prisoners, the day the impossible became real, one of the strangest, most inspiring, and most forgotten battles of World War II. Drop a comment if this story blew your mind and hit subscribe for more untold history.